Good morning, Dawg Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We are happy to have you with us. I am so happy to be back. A great time on board Independence of the Seas for a fun weekend Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Back here today and ready to go and ready to roll all the way through the 2023 season as Georgia gets ready to go for 3 in 23 here very, very, very soon. So we're going to talk about all of that today. We'll react to some of the big news that dropped just as I was leaving last week involving Dylan Raiola. A topic we hit not too long ago, we feel the need to hit again today. We're going to touch on that here coming up in just a moment. We'll laugh at Florida for getting kicked around last night in the conclusion of the College World Series. That is always a fun thing. Connor Riley stops by. He joins us today there as well. So we got a lot to do. We're glad to do it with all of you. So what do you say? Without further ado, we get it all started. Haven't been live in a while, but we'll do it live here today. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Proofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I have said this before, and if you don't mind me repeating myself, let me say this again. One of the best things for me about my own life is the fact that after a great vacation, I had one this weekend, took a little weekend cruise on board Independence of the Seas with our friends at Royal Caribbean, my entire family on board with me. We had a great time. And I love that. But the feeling I get when you come back from something like that, the excitement, the eagerness to get to work, that is just such a good feeling. I hope everybody gets a chance to experience that in life where you don't have that dread about, I got to go back to work. You know, to me, there's an excitement, there's an energy about coming back to work, especially this time of year because the calendar is almost ready to sort of shift to July. We've got full sights set on the 2023 season. There's so much to be excited about here with these Georgia Bulldogs. So with all of that said, it is great to be back with you after a couple of days worth of pre-recorded shows. Hope you enjoyed those. We certainly enjoyed putting those together, but we especially enjoy being live, at least recording live for those of you who kind of watch or listen a little bit later on, and we're glad to be doing that today. Let me begin this way. Thinking about this a little bit over the course of mostly yesterday, kind of starting to get back into the flow of things and sort of put some thoughts together for the shows. We may see in college football here this year two kind of late-stage empires finally crumble. Two sort of late-stage dynasties finally kind of, give way and fully come to the ground. One of these I think you're very well aware of. One of these you may not quite have thought about it quite this way, but soon you may see exactly what I'm talking about here. And as a way of setting this up, let me kind of go back to an issue that we addressed. It wasn't that long ago where we kind of did a show and we were kind of getting on Kirk Herbstreit a little bit because Herbstreit was making this big case for Alabama winning the national championship this year. And his argument for that was, well, just when you count Alabama out, that's when they become the most dangerous. And what we pointed out at the time was that Herbstreit had said the exact same thing a year ago, could not have been more wrong, and yet he comes out and trots out the same argument again here for 2023, that just seemed ludicrous, the idea that he was just sort of rubber stamping the same argument from a year ago, the same talking points that were struck down a year ago, this idea of, man, Alabama's angry. They've got revenge on their mind for the upcoming season. Well, guess what? Last year, especially late in the season when it came time for the college football playoff, Alabama was nowhere to be found. This notion that somehow the energy and the motivation you get when you are doubted, that fuels Alabama, that was proved last year to be false because Alabama couldn't feed off that very well. They had the best offensive player in the country in Bryce Young. They may have had the best defensive player, at least one of the best defensive players in the country, and Will Anderson Jr. They had motivation on their side because they were counted out because they had lost to Georgia the previous year, but that motivation was just kind of a false fuel. It was just kind of an inefficient fuel in terms of providing them the energy they need to win the national championship. Yet that doesn't stop Kirk Herbstreit. We played this for you the other day. That doesn't stop Kirk Herbstreit from coming on whatever it was that he was on and making the case for Alabama to do whatever because they're being counted out and they're being doubted or whatever else. Well, I regret to inform you that Kirk Herbstreit is now doubling down on this opinion, going on a different show, making essentially the same kind of argument once again. He was on the other day with Pat McAfee. Of course, you know McAfee, maybe many of you do. Kind of a sensation in media, now signed a contract to be a part of the ESPN family now moving forward. One of the biggest names in broadcasting here right now. He's a part of ESPN's College Game Day there as well. And Herbstreit was on with McAfee, and they're talking about the experience of, doing game day together and the excitement of the college football season. And in the midst of this discussion, Kirk Herbstreit doubles down on the same opinion that he expressed the other day, that somehow Alabama is more dangerous than Georgia because Alabama has these so-called doubters here right now. This sets us up for where we need to go today. So let's hear Kirk Herbstreit with Pat McAfee from last week while I was gone.
And now the storyline, seemingly the big one takeaway is is Kirby Smart, John Cena to The Rock, Nick Saban? Is your time is up, my time is now? Is that a whole part of this entire conversation? Like, Saban's not going to go.
You got to be a step ahead of everything in this world, right? Be really careful of listening to. David Pollack said it's a new. That's right when Alabama comes back and just throws their trump card down and whips everyone's. I haven't even really dug in. I'm already leaning to Alabama to win the national championship. Just when you say Nick's done, Alabama's done, Kirby goodbye, here comes Alabama. They're going to win it all. So if I'm betting right now, I don't even know what it says in Vegas. I'm betting Alabama to win the national championship.
I
would say at this point it's guaranteed. We'll see it with injuries and what happens, but do not sleep on Bama.
So after Kirk Herbstreit said what he said the other day, essentially the same thing that he said there, and having it pointed out that, hey, you know what, you kind of made the same argument a year ago. That wasn't true. It seems even less true now because of the fact that Alabama was kind of nowhere to be found last year. The fact that Kirk Herbstreit doubles down on that argument would lead you to believe that he in this particular case, he simply does not care about getting the facts right, doesn't care, just wants to have something to say when he goes on shows like this. And we are not anti-Herbstreit people necessarily. Generally speaking, I kind of enjoy what Kirk Herbstreit has done on TV over the course of years. And there have been plenty of times, think back to 2018, for instance, Kirk Herbstreit openly touted for Georgia to make the playoff that year, despite the fact they hadn't won the SEC. Even in 2020, Kirk Herbstreit was kind of pro-Georgia late in the season when the claim that Georgia was one of the 4 best teams was pretty specious. Even at that time, Kirk Herbstreit was kind of on board and sort of touting for Georgia. So Herbstreit is not one of these guys that has a long history of being anti-Georgia or anything like that. I don't want to sell this as something that it isn't. Herbstreit, typically speaking, isn't a Georgia hater. I believe what Herbstreit is just sort of slow to get with the picture. And Pat McAfee probably said it better. You can think about, for those of you who know professional wrestling, once there was The Rock, then there was John Cena. John Cena sort of overtook The Rock as the top star in that particular version of sports entertainment. And in some respects, it does sort of feel like Kirby Smart sort of moving Nick Saban off the stage. And Kirby Smart will be the guy doing the "you can't see me" gesture here very soon, as Nick Saban has to watch, from afar. That may be the better description of what Pat McAfee says there. Herbstreit, not a Georgia hater. Herbstreit just sort of slow to get with the picture, it sort of seems like, and content to be sort of swallowed up by his own misinformation that somehow Alabama has this revenge edge on its side because people no longer believe them. If anything, what's true is that people no longer believe in Alabama because they are no longer worthy of being believed. And Kirk Herbstreit doesn't quite seem to be aware of that. Now, let me answer a big question here, because there are some people who might wonder, well, why does any of this matter? Why does Kirk Herbstreit saying what he said about Alabama, picking them to win the national championship over Georgia, why does this matter? And I think there are a couple of reasons why this is true. First of all, Herbstreit isn't the only one from ESPN's College Game Day to already make a big deal about someone other than Georgia winning the national championship this offseason. We have played for you before the clip of Reese Davis. Reese, another guy that we kind of like. I enjoy Reese Davis' work on TV, but a couple of months ago, he was on some show somewhere saying that he thought Michigan would be the number 1 team. So here you have the most prominent collection of voices in our sport, ESPN's College Game Day, the show that airs every Saturday morning. And already in this portion of the offseason, you have 2 of the voices on that show, recognizable faces, prominent voices, picking someone other than Georgia to win the national championship. And I think the Georgia fans have a right to be bothered by that, because Georgia fans have been waiting for their moment in the sun for quite some time. 40 years of whatever, and Georgia has finally arrived. Not just to win a national championship, but to win 2 national championships. And I think the Georgia fans are right, or they have a right to say, we want all the privileges that come our way with being as good as our favorite team is right now. We want to enjoy all the spoils of victory. And that means having the media take the proper tact or conversation when it comes to how they address your team. We said this on one of our pre-recorded shows last week. Pay very close attention to who does and doesn't acknowledge what is obviously the biggest topic in our sport here right now. The fact that Georgia's trying to do this season something that has not been done since the 1930s, won a third straight national championship. And the fact that Georgia is, according to Vegas and sports books and things like that, they are the favorite to be able to do that. This isn't just an incredible piece of history that could happen. This is an incredible piece of history that is expected to happen, at least according to those who kind of put their money where their mouth is in Las Vegas or various sports books across our country here right now. Pay very close attention to who acknowledges that and pay very close attention to who doesn't acknowledge that. And in this particular case, Kirk Herbstreit is not acknowledging that. The real conversation shouldn't be, hey, who other than Georgia could win the national championship? The real question should be kind of some of the stuff we heard back when Tiger Woods was first dominating golf or when Michael Jordan was maybe dominating the NBA. The real question is it Georgia versus the field? Not is it, Georgia, but also all these other teams. Georgia just won last year's national championship 65-7. You've heard of like Secretariat, the great racehorse. All that happened before I was born, happened before many of you were born there as well. But you know who Secretariat was because of how dominant Secretariat was. You see the picture of Secretariat, the racehorse, at the Belmont Stakes, the third leg of the Triple Crown, and Secretariat's way out front, and the rest of the horses were, seemingly, I don't know. If you see the picture, it looked like they're miles behind. It wasn't quite that big, but way behind. Well, guess what? The college football version of Secretariat of the Belmont was last year's national championship. Georgia beat the second-best team in the country 65-7. You say, well, TCU wasn't really the second-best team in the country. Well, they beat Michigan. Alabama had lost twice. These teams that had a chance to be there, they weren't there. Georgia was, and Georgia was beating the national runner-up 65-7. So when you have that to conclude one year, it is inappropriate the next year to have two members, the most prominent show, on TV, basically making the case, for somebody else other than Georgia so quick here during the offseason. I think the Georgia fans have a right to be bothered by that. But there is one more point that I think is worth mentioning here, because the real issue is not, if Herbstreit turns out to be wrong, the fact that Alabama once and for all will seemingly finally be a crumbled and toppled empire, that its dynasty will have finally fully faded into true total oblivion. And the argument of just when you count out Nick Saban, that's when he's his most dangerous. The true expiration date on that argument may be reached this year. I think there's something else that's worth pointing out here for a moment, that Alabama might not be the only college football empire destined to come to an end. I want you to listen to this Kirk Herbstreit clip again, and Kaylee Mansell, who's producing today. Kaylee, if you don't mind, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to play this again. I want you to notice that something else that Kirk Herbstreit says here that I think really sticks out in the day and age in which we live right now. This shouldn't be missed. This is, I think, a really interesting spotlight on how the college football media world works right now, and I think it's important for us to address. Let's hear Kirk Herbstreit one more time, please.
And now the storyline, seemingly the big one takeaway is Kirby Smart, John Cena to The Rock, Nick Saban? Is your time is up, my time is now? Is that a whole part of this entire conversation? Like, Saban's not going to go.
You got to be a step ahead of everything in this world, right? Be really careful of listening to. David Pollock said it's a new. That's right when Alabama comes back and just throws their trump card down and whips everyone's. I haven't even really dug in. I'm already leaning to Alabama to win the national championship. just when you say Nick's done, Alabama's done, Kirby goodbye, here comes Alabama. They're going to win it all. So if I'm betting right now, I don't even know what it says in Vegas. I'm betting Alabama to win the national championship. I would say at this point it's guaranteed. We'll see it with injuries and what happens, but do not sleep on Bama.
Let me tell you what I noticed about that clip. Keep in mind here for a moment. ESPN has had a total monopoly on essentially all of college football for a long time. They basically control the college football playoff. They have had a stranglehold on all the biggest games for a long time. And that has made someone like Kirk Herbstreit very famous because he is the most prominent voice speaking about college football. And yet Herbstreit, we're in almost July now. Herbstreit says in that conversation with Pat McAfee, I haven't even really started to dig in yet on the season. Where you been, Kirk? Kirk Herbstreit says, I'm not even aware of the posted odds for who's most likely to win the national championship. What have you been doing, Kirk? See, this to me is an example of something that I think is slowly starting to change, and I think everybody needs to pay close attention to this. That at one point in time, the only thing being said about college football that mattered was what ESPN was saying about college football, because they essentially owned all of college football. They literally own a lot of the bowl games that you watch in December. ESPN literally owns the game. They have essentially owned the sport for quite some time. And when you have a total monopoly, this is the reason why we are anti-monopoly, generally speaking. When you have a monopoly over something, eventually you sort of get fat and happy. Eventually, you sort of lose your competitive edge. Eventually, you sort of lose your fighting spirit. You sort of, control everything. Think about like whatever industry you like or care about. When anything sort of approaches monopoly, the entity that becomes a monopoly, the quality of service sometimes goes down. The product delivered sometimes becomes less impressive. Monopolies are generally speaking not a good thing. Broadly speaking, people don't like monopolies. Well, ESPN has had a monopoly on college football. It has made Kirk Herbstreit very, very rich, very, very famous. In response to that, I can kick back all summer. I don't have to look at any college football news. College football is whatever I say that it is. I don't have to be paying attention here. And you're led to believe that Kirk Herbstreit, while he's been, doing whatever else, and listen, Kirk Herbstreit's a rich dude, but while he's been doing whatever else, has he paid attention to the fact that Alabama didn't exactly have the world's greatest spring practice, and Alabama didn't exactly have much of a quarterback situation kind of resolved there, and that Georgia brings back what it brings back, and that Georgia has, as much going for it as it does? I think you're led to believe here that being on top of a college football monopoly has made Kirk Herbstreit a little bit disconnected from the actual sport itself. And, you go back to 2015 when we started DawgNation Daily here, and I don't toot my own horn very much. I'm a little bit, hopefully you see me as a modest person. I don't do stuff like that. But way back then, what we realized is that those who had a monopoly on college football, they weren't providing enough college football content to the people who cared about college football. There was this insatiable appetite that fans had to have college football delivered to them on a daily basis. They didn't want their most prominent voices in their sport kind of checking in and checking out and going months without paying attention to college football, and then coming on some show, late summer, spewing some nonsense that was poorly informed. College football fans wanted more than that. And so we kind of started what I think has kind of grown after us into the idea that college football ought to be covered 12 months a year. It ought to be covered 52 weeks of the year. And there's always stuff worth talking about. The sport is always worth paying attention to. It is the second most popular sport in all of America. The NFL is number one. You can't certainly unseat that anytime soon. College football is obviously the second most popular sport that we have. And so given the popularity of the sport, given the fact that Georgia fans and fans of other teams there as well are as plugged in as they are to the sport, it deserves to be covered every single day. That's why we do DawgNation Daily, because college football, Georgia fans in this case in particular, deserve to have their team covered every single day. And yet at ESPN, they don't quite seem to understand that. So when you hear Kirk Herbstreit touting some nonsense, falsifiable, easily falsifiable nonsense about Alabama, this isn't just a statement about Alabama as kind of a late-stage empire. I think it's also a statement about ESPN as a late-stage empire. That ESPN has completely controlled all of college football for a long time, but their monopoly has made them fat and happy. Their monopoly, their ivory tower of cash that's built for them, has disconnected them from the people who actually care about college football and follow on a regular basis. So when you hear Kirk Herbstreit saying when he say there, it shouldn't make you mad. It should actually make you feel sorry for Kirk. Because Kirk has kind of floated off into some sort of like nether regions of disconnect from the actual sport and what kind of makes college football so fun and so cool. That eventually when you kind of build yourself a big enough mansion, you kind of wall yourself off from the actual public, and you sort of lose connection to what makes the sport operate. And then that's where you kind of see Kirk Herbstreit right now. I think Herbstreit's statement is also a reflection of kind of where ESPN is too. At one point in time, they controlled the entirety of this sport. But now Fox is kind of popping up here on the scene. Now the internet is definitely popping up. Shows like this who talk real college football to real college football fans. And all of a sudden now the ESPN control, the ESPN narrative that they want to establish, all of a sudden that doesn't quite take shape the way that it used to, because there are a lot of people who look at someone like Kirk Herbstreit saying this and saying, well, I can prove that's wrong just by saying this, that, and the other. Very interesting times in which we live, where the former powerful entity that controlled everything all of a sudden it seems like their control is slipping. And all of a sudden it seems like they're a step behind on the sport they're supposed to own. And in the case of the Georgia Bulldogs this upcoming season, I think that could be good news. ESPN may not believe in them. ESPN may not be touting them. But when it's all said and done, go for 3-23. I think real fans know that's where we're heading. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We're glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all kinds of video platforms, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. We are just happy to have you with us and happy to be back here live again after a couple of days off, enjoying some time with family, but now enjoying being back at work. And certainly glad to be doing all of that with you. Radio Noon, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. And all these platforms and all of this ability to deliver the show to you on a daily basis, real college football talk for real college football fans, not stale, old, tired arguments like they vomit out on ESPN. It would not be possible if not for great sponsors like our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, because we love what they do. They're proud partners of UGA, which is cool. It's fun to do business with those that support the Dogs, because when you think about how you keep your program strong, obviously supporting those that support it, that's kind of a good thing to do, and that's obviously what Engineered Solutions of Georgia is all about. I'm also very grateful for the fact they have been longtime friends of ours of DawgNation Daily, really as loyal a partner as we've had, and I'm proud to tell their story. But beyond all of that, I've been to their facilities, I've met with their people, I've seen them in action, and I truly believe that for homeowners who deal with foundation issues, waterproofing issues, these are things that kind of threaten the structural integrity of your home, and they threaten potentially, your most valuable asset, the place you got your emotional connection, your financial connection, all of the stuff that sort of centers around your own home, all of that threatened by a foundation issue or waterproofing issue. That's why you want our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia on the job for you, because they've got an entire team of engineers on staff ready to solve your problem. You got water creeping in where it's not supposed to be. You're seeing those sort of like stair-step cracks in your brick, or you're seeing those kind of, cracks somewhere in the walls. Signs of a bigger problem maybe, and certainly an indication to you, kind of a signal to you. Oh yeah, BA said if I see this, give ESOG a call. And that's what Engineered Solutions of Georgia is all about. They'll talk to you. If it's a simple fix, boom, they'll tell you how to do it. If it's a larger fix, that's why you want good, hardworking, smart folks like the people in Engineered Solutions of Georgia on the job for you. So please give them a call, 678-ESOG now. That is 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We are so happy to have them as a part of our program, and we think they will do great work for you. So check out Engineered Solutions of Georgia today. All right, so in a couple of minutes, we're going to talk to Connor Riley. Fun to do that. We'll catch up on a couple of the UGA recruiting stories that we've kind of missed since I've been gone, and kind of cover a lot of that ground here coming up with Connor in just a minute. Before that, though, let me go around the doghouse. Let me address the one big story that I briefly got to discuss like the day I was leaving to go out of town. That is when the Dylan Raiola Buford news became official. We had actually talked about that with Jeff Sintel before. It became official whatever day that was, Wednesday, I guess. And so now we can kind of talk about this as a real thing. It is happening. I had a chance to share some brief thoughts on this, I guess, on Wednesday. But I want to share now my reaction to some of the reaction to all of this. And I'll tell you what it kind of brings to mind for me. It's actually been a few years ago. It's kind of crazy thinking how long ago this was. But one of the events that had nothing to do with college football that I think had a huge impact on college football was however many years ago this was now, when LeBron James left the Cleveland Cavaliers, went to the Miami Heat, and kind of created, at that time, sort of the idea of a super team in the NBA, and a lot of folks didn't like that. I would say that at the time I didn't like that. And the way in which LeBron did that on TV, the phrase that kind of still lives on, kind of died down a little bit because enough time has passed. But for a while, the kind of the catchphrase that James made famous, I'm taking my talents to South Beach. For a long time in high school football recruiting, you heard that phrase used a lot. I'm taking my talents to here. I'm taking my talents to there. Big cultural touchstone like LeBron James, big cultural icon like LeBron James. He says something, it kind of becomes part of the lexicon. And LeBron James' way of leaving Cleveland, going to Miami, the decision broadcast on ESPN, another failed venture for them, I would say. But the idea of taking my talents to South Beach, creating the super team, I think that created a category in people's mind that I think still sort of lives on right now, the sort of unpleasant departure from one team to the other. And I think that people are always on guard for a sort of LeBron James style, joining the Miami Heat. And people kind of are on guard against that. And some of the anti-transfer portal stuff that exists right now, I think is sort of based on the idea of, we don't like it when a talented player leaves a tougher situation for an easier situation. We don't like it when that happens. That feels like LeBron James going to the Miami Heat, stacking the deck in his favor. And whether people know that or not, that's a sort of subliminal, subconscious thing that I think exists in sports. And I saw some reaction to Dylan Raiola leaving his state of Arizona to come here to the state of Georgia, play his high school football his senior season at Buford. That sort of felt like, to me, kind of familiar backlash, almost as if they were criticizing Raiola for what some people viewed as leaving a tougher situation to come to an easier situation. After all, Buford's a 7A power, and maybe hand-selecting a team for his senior year. And I want to tell you something right now. I believe that anyone who's been critical of Raiola kind of on those grounds of, too many transfers, whatever else, I just feel like they're flat wrong. And I think that's going to be corrected. I think it's going to be called out. And I think it's important to kind of get this right on a number of fronts. Because what Dylan Raiola chose to do by leaving Arizona and come to Georgia, he didn't put himself into a hand-picked easier situation. Life gets way tougher for Dylan Raiola right now. Because whatever gap you perceive to exist between the SEC and the Pac-12, I promise you, wherever you think the SEC is compared to the Pac-12, I promise you, the gap between Georgia high school football and Arizona high school football is even wider. And that's no disrespect to guys like Keely Ringo who played in Arizona. There's obviously some good teams and some talented players. I'm not trying to speak too broadly here, but the overall gap between Arizona high school football and Georgia high school football is wider than the gap between the SEC and the Pac-12. It just is. So what Raiola did was he entered into a more competitive situation when he comes here to the state of Georgia to play. And, we're led to believe, we understand, that had he stayed in Arizona because of some, procedural rules, things like that, would not have been eligible to play the first 5 games of his senior year. So would it have been better for Raiola not to play, kind of kicking back, relaxing, and just biding his time to come to college, because he could have done that. I mean, the last couple of years, because of the pandemic, things like that, we've actually seen some players not play, their senior years. It's becoming a little bit more common for high school players not to play much high school football. We see reclassifications, things like that. We see high school players not playing high school football for various reasons a lot the last couple of years. Well, Dylan Raiola's not doing that. Dylan Raiola is going to be playing at the highest possible level, 7A in the state of Georgia, here for this upcoming season. What is the phrase that gets used sometimes? Apparently, Dylan Raiola wants that smoke. He wants to be down here where the challenge is going to be greatest, because if you follow high school football, you know this. Buford did not win in 7A a year ago. And while Dylan Raiola is a great player, I think rightly selected as the number 1 player in the entire country, y'all, Dylan Raiola is not going to walk into Georgia high school football and light this state on fire. He's just not. I mean, he may be the best player in the state, but it is not going to be easy, right? This is not one of those things where Dylan Raiola is going to come around and start kicking around every team that he plays in Georgia high school football, because, as you all are very well aware, Georgia high school football teams are very, very, very good. It's hard to be much better of a high school player than Justice Haynes was a year ago. And guess what? Buford didn't even get past second round. Lost the Walton game was second round a year ago. They didn't win the state championship a year ago with a guy like Justice Haynes on the roster, including all the other 5 stars they had. So Dylan Raiola has now put himself into a very competitive situation a few months prior to going to the University of Georgia. In other words, I don't see any negatives around the Raiola move at all. I think it's certainly good for Georgia to have a guy like Raiola so close to campus. It gives him a chance to go there more frequently. But I think it's also good for Georgia to let Raiola kind of test himself against very, very tough, very, very intense competition prior to arriving at UGA. I think that Dylan will get a chance to learn something about himself. I think it's always important. I mean, Kirby Smart said this himself going back, January, about the idea of, hey, you want to find players who hate to lose, who will do anything to win. But when you're not playing in the most competitive environment possible, you don't learn as much about your own competitive fire, your own competitive spirit. You don't know what kind of competitor you are until you're actually competing for your life. And in Georgia high school football at the highest level, that is what Dylan Raiola is going to be doing. Now, listen, if you really do follow that level of the sport here in our state, maybe you don't love Buford or you don't love this or you don't love whatever, you can have your own opinions on that. But in terms of Raiola leaving a less competitive situation for a more competitive situation, leaving a situation where you'd be playing less football for a situation now where we'll be playing more football, y'all, that ain't nothing but good. And you can say, well, what does this do for, relationships with guys like KJ Bolden or something like that? Hey, maybe that's going to be all, good there as well. Maybe Raiola could, truly have an influence, or maybe Georgia doesn't need the influence. Maybe Georgia's already destined to win the KJ Bolden recruitment. Ultimately, who knows about that? That's still to be determined. But in terms of how you evaluate Raiola as a player, how Raiola sets himself up for success at Georgia, being at Buford, competing against the Mariettas and the North Cobbs and the Carrolltons and all the teams that kind of exist, at that classification in this state right now, Dylan Raiola will now be much more prepared to begin his career at Georgia than he otherwise would be. And so I am very excited about the move. And that is Around the Dawghouse, presented today, of course, on DawgNation Daily by our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, as we always do each and every Tuesday. Someone else who's had plenty to say about all of this has been our buddy Connor Riley. He's also been manning the walls here at DawgNation while I've been gone the last couple of days. So a lot to cover with him right now. So let's dive in here, get ready to do that. Busy time for UGA recruiting, aftermath of the Raiola news, and including some of the chatter that's out there about Georgia here this preseason. Let's cover it all with Connor Riley here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me bring in Connor Riley, who's, as I said before, been covering this story for quite some time over the course of the last week or so. I had a chance to briefly discuss this with Connor and Jeff Sintel on a video the other day. They obviously have talked more about that since then. So, Connor, from my perspective, I don't see any negative on the Raiola thing whatsoever. It seems like I've seen some pushback from like casual observers, sort of mainstream folks who maybe sort of see this as another guy changing teams, kind of what that sort of does to the overall conversation. But in terms of Raiola's, preparation to be at Georgia, in terms of evaluating him as a prospect, in terms of just the sheer entertainment value, everything about Raiola being in Georgia, in the state of Georgia for senior year, is better than had he stayed out in Arizona, I believe.
Yeah, it does compel me to point out that the history of guys that have played at multiple high schools, especially in the very public manner that Dylan has, it's not great, and obviously every situation is different, but you look at guys like Jermaine Burton, Bear Alexander in particular, guys that played at multiple high schools during the course of their college, or high school career rather, and how that impacted their time at Georgia. That is something that Kirby Smart is at least aware of in terms of recruiting and, usually guys that they target. However, I think largely you are correct. The positives here outweigh the small negatives, I think, that come with this. The fact that he's going to be teammates with KJ Bolden, I think, is significant as Georgia tries to land who is now the number 2 player in the state per most rankings. I think, the fact that he's going to be able to be at every Georgia home game this year much easier than he would have been were he still coming from Phoenix or from the Arizona area. I think that is an added plus, and just in terms of his presence on game days, I think it's going to be bigger. And, look, as skeptical as I am of this, there is a world where Carson Beck has a fantastic year, develops into a first-round draft pick, and heads off to the NFL draft. He's going to be able to be around this Georgia program a lot more, be able to shoot over to a practice if and when he wants to do that. And so I think that does give him a little bit of a head start, knowing that he has the potential to hit the ground running next year. And, again, as unlikely as I think it is, there is a world I see existing where he is in a position to start right away as a freshman. So I think those are all largely outweigh the benefit of, well, this is his 4th high school during the course of his high school career.
Let me make a weird comparison for a moment. This almost kind of reminds me, potentially, if it works out for the positive, a little bit like Nick Saban going to Alabama, which is a very strange comparison, Dylan Raiola with Nick Saban. But it's hard for people to remember this. But when Saban first took the job at Alabama in 2007, one of the knocks on Nick Saban was, okay, well, Alabama got Saban, but how long can they keep him? Nick Saban was sort of thought of in 2007 of being a little bit of a job hopper. He had been at Michigan State, then went to LSU, then from LSU went to the Miami Dolphins, then he only stayed at the Miami Dolphins 2 years. Now he's hopping to Alabama. That he was a little bit of a job hopper by perception way back then. But even back then, I sort of defend him as every move that Saban had made sort of made sense in the context of why he made it. Got to the NFL, decided he didn't like it, kind of bounced back to college, and then he stayed at Alabama and became kind of a permanent fixture there as a part of that program. And he's been there such a long time now, it's sort of hard to remember a time in which people kind of thought of him as being a little bit of a transient type figure in college football. So I think the Raiola thing could be similar, that if you look at the moves that he's made, I think there's a justifiable reason for every move that he has made, as long as he now becomes this sort of permanent fixture on the Georgia roster in the state of Georgia. As long as he kind of plants roots now, every move prior to this sort of can be explained as the build-up, the lead-up to kind of his sort of permanent home there. Now, if it doesn't work out that way, then we'll say, well, the past was kind of prologue and sort of proved all of this. But in some respects, I think when you look at the Raiola past, all the moves that he's made sense in the context of that decision, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So, yes, and I largely agree with you. But, again, the quarterback position is one where if you're not the guy, you transfer. And look, the numbers are what the numbers are at Georgia. Every five-star quarterback that has come through here, with the exception of Brock Vandagriff, who we spent most of spring sort of focusing on and discussing whether or not he was going to transfer, has in fact transferred out of this program. And look, some people might say that's a negative. Some people might be worried about that. That's just the reality of this position, especially at high-profile schools like Georgia, like Alabama, et cetera, things along the lines of that. And it's just sort of the reality of, that's life in college football these days. Look, a lot of people really thought that JT Daniels was going to be the guy. A lot of people really wanted to see him work out. He got beat out by Stetson Bennett, and Stetson Bennett won 2 national championships, and JT Daniels is now on his, I believe, fourth school. He's going to be the quarterback at Rice. Stetson Bennett's going to be a backup for the Los Angeles Rams this year. And so, I get, the worry and the thought of transfer and quarterbacks leaving to go elsewhere. The reality is Kirby Smart has done as good a job as anyone in this sport in terms of insulating their teams to not be dependent on a quarterback. He builds along the lines of scrimmage, the defensive line and offensive line. And while, yes, Stetson Bennett was great last year and a big reason Georgia won the national championship, I think more often than not, Kirby Smart would like his program to not be dependent on a quarterback, to not be dependent on a single entity, given that Georgia's depth is what separates them from 99% of the college football programs out there.
And, you kind of wrote about this the other day, and I honestly can't remember how much we've talked about this, but I think it's important we talk about it again, even if we've already discussed it, because I addressed this on one of my shows last week, too. The idea that, Raiola wants to wear number 15. Carson Beck currently wears number 15. I'm not trying to create a controversy here. I'm just trying to say that symbolically, and I think that's what you touched on in the piece you wrote at DawgNation.com, there's a very interesting kind of subliminal message here, which is that Carson Beck represents the current present for Georgia football, and Dylan Raiola potentially represents the future. But that's only true if Beck decides to leave. There were a lot of people in 2021 who thought, well, of course Stetson Bennett's going to ride off into the sunset. He just won a national championship. But Bennett's like, why would I leave? This is fun. I enjoy being the quarterback for Georgia football. And honestly, I'm not quite so sure that Carson Beck might not arrive at the same decision of, okay, well, I'm the quarterback here for 2023, at least we presume right now, but there's no reason why this has to be a one-and-done situation. If Beck wanted to, including this year, he could be the Georgia quarterback for the next 3 years, assuming that Georgia wanted that, there as well. I think all of the talk about Raiola, and I think legitimately he has a prospect worth discussing as much as we have, but all of the talk about Raiola and the curiosity about guys like Brock Vandagriff and Gunnar Stockton, I think it obscures, perhaps unfairly, the fact that Carson Beck could be only now just beginning his career at Georgia if that's what both parties kind of want.
Right, and look, there's a very real scenario where Carson Beck has a good year, Georgia wins another national championship, Carson Beck decides he needs to come back again next year to further develop as a college quarterback. Again, the list of quarterbacks drafted in the first round that have 16 or fewer starts, which Carson Beck will after this coming season, it's Mitch Trubisky, it's Anthony Richardson, it's Cam Newton, it's Mark Sanchez. That's not a great list to be a part of, especially when you consider that Newton and Richardson were just far better athletes, and that played a factor, and I would include Trubisky in there as well, into why they were seen as first-round picks. And so, if that's through the window that which we view this prism, I do think that, again, there's a world where for the next 4 years, Georgia's starting quarterback wears the number 15 jersey, and then there's a different path out there. And so, again, I don't think it's that big of a deal, and I would agree with you that, Dylan says he wants to come in and wear 15. That makes a lot of sense. And there's a world where Carson starts the next 2 years, wears number 15, Dylan is there for 1 year wearing a different number. When Carson leaves, Dylan takes over the number 15 and potentially the starting quarterback spot there. But I think the larger thing here is the idea that, look, Georgia's got it set up for the future with its quarterback position, but it's certainly not written in stone. Again, I think Carson has to go out there and prove that he's capable of having a good year. And while we like Carson back and can think he can certainly be an NFL quarterback as much, it's a deep quarterback class this year with guys like Caleb Williams, with a guy like Drake May, with a guy like Michael Penix Jr., who's played a lot of football, Bo Nix similarly from Oregon. I'm not saying all those guys are going to be taken ahead of him, but Carson Beck's going to have a good amount more questions than those guys, and the fact that he isn't a plus athlete, you're at best maybe looking at him being maybe the third or fourth quarterback taken, and would you rather have that, just given the track record of how that has worked out for guys, or potentially come back, continue to get better, and improve on that? And again, all this has to happen first. Carson Beck has still not started a game, and we're already sitting here batting around the idea that he might be a first-round draft pick quarterback. There's still a long runway to go here when it comes to the future of the Georgia quarterback position and Carson Beck in particular.
And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on jersey numbers, but I guess by rule, Beck and Riley could both wear 15. The only time you can't wear the same number as somebody else, you run the field at the same time, which I can't imagine a scenario where Beck and Riley will be on the field together at the same time. So I guess technically speaking, they could both wear number 15, I guess.
Correct. I believe last year Gunnar Stockton and Eric Gilbert both wore number 4, so that is the sort of scenario that you outlined there.
All right, so let me shift gears to something else. And I think most people kind of get this. You and I do very different jobs at DawgNation. You're an objective reporter covering Georgia. I'm a show host. You report the news. I basically respond to the news. We do different jobs. But one of the reasons why I like talking to you is because I think that while you don't kind of come from the voice of the fan perspective the way that I do, I think you do understand fans here pretty well. You are a sports fan, generally speaking. And I'm curious if you kind of get my point when I say I think that Georgia fans have a right to be a little perturbed that, Kirk Herbstreit's going around all summer long touting Alabama to win the national championship using the most sort of specious logic possible. Reese Davis is picking Michigan, on and on you go, where it doesn't feel like Georgia's dominance of college football has been fully acknowledged. And I think for Georgia fans who've waited for a long time to be on top of the sport, I think they have a right, myself included here, to want all the spoils that come with that, all the privileges that come your way when you finally have conquered all of college football. And it seems like some of that's been a little slow to come. And Georgia fans being a little annoyed by that, I think they have every right to feel that way. Do you agree?
Yes, but be careful what you wish for would be the sort of tone that I take there. And look, people have a hard thing. Change is hard for a lot of people. And no one, as a Patriots fan, you thought Tom Brady was going to play and win Super Bowls for the Patriots forever. And then he goes to Tampa and he does that. The Patriots have been rather mediocre of late there, and so you don't realize the end is coming until it's too late. And I think, there's a chance that happens with Alabama and Nick Saban for all the talk about them. Like, look, LSU is a team that is going to give them problems this year. Texas, I think similarly, that's going to be a really interesting game when those two teams meet in Tuscaloosa. And so I think, from the Alabama standpoint of this, that certainly clouds it. And again, while yes, Kirby Smart has won the same number of national championships as Nick Saban has since Kirby Smart left Alabama, so much of this is still clouded by the fact that Nick Saban has won 6 national championships at Alabama, and he's still there. And for the most part, they're still competing in those, for those national championships. They were just playing for one 2 seasons ago in the 2021 season, looking to go back-to-back after winning in 2020, as much as that is a Mickey Mouse championship, because all pandemic titles are Mickey Mouse championships in my eyes. And so I do think that, again, that's just people are being slow to change, and Alabama has been at the top of the sport. And I think as you pointed out, it's just sort of easy to just say, hey, well, Alabama's going to figure this out. When, you and I have discussed this before. You look at how Alabama was recruiting in certainly the 2019 class, I think that 2020 class as well, and then the 2021 class, well, yes, they signed the number 1 class there. We knew less about that class than any recruiting class ever. And so that's a year where maybe you don't quite put as much stock into the top of those recruiting rankings as you do other years there. And so, the fact that Alabama hasn't had the same level of success and hit rate with their recruits of late there, I do think that sort of factors into why maybe it's been tough for people to keep up with the idea that Georgia has passed them, given, well, yes, say in I believe the 2019 recruiting cycle, Alabama finished ahead of Georgia. Anyone would take Georgia's recruiting class that cycle over Alabama's. I think if you even look at the 2020 class, even with guys like Bryce Young and Will Anderson in that class, I think people on its whole, you'd still probably prefer to have what Georgia had there. And in the 2021 class, just to sort of illustrate the point, Buck Bowers was not a top 100 overall player in the 2021 recruiting rankings.
Yeah.
There are not 3 players in this sport that are better than him. I believe Marvin Harrison Jr., also probably either the second or third best player in this sport, was somewhere in like the 80s, 90s, around that 100 range there. So, those recruiting rankings are a big reason why Alabama is still seen as a top team. And the reality is that this program in each of the last 2 years has gotten worse. And while, they only lost 2 games in 2021 and they only lost 2 games in 2022, this program has taken a step back from where it was certainly in 2020, but even in those like 2017, 2018, 2019 before Tua got hurt sort of seasons there. And so it's a program that is taken steps back. And, while sure you can say, oh, don't count out Nick Saban yet, I mean, it's a program that's been trending down. As far as Michigan, I do see why, someone might be interested in them. Ohio State has a lot to replace in their offensive line, and while, yes, you can largely trust that offensive infrastructure, for a team that has kind of gotten pushed around a little bit, certainly by Michigan, Georgia to an extent in last year's game in the Peach Bowl, you sort of see there, some level of concern there with Michigan. They bring back a lot of enticing pieces. They've proven that they can replace and sustain on both the offensive and defensive lines, sort of similar to Georgia. Their issue has been, they get to the college football playoffs and sort of just get caught with the pants around their ankles. And there's no reason that Michigan team should have lost to the TCU team that Georgia played. That's just inexcusable. And so it's one of those things. And look, as a media member myself, I do this. There are times you try and say, all right, well, I don't want to pick the obvious team. I want to pick someone else that I think can win and potentially make me look smart. I'm not going to lie. I kind of did this with Georgia last year when everybody was picking Alabama. I sort of zagged, thinking that Georgia had just as talented a team, and ultimately that proved to be correct there. The reality is, I think Georgia fans know they're the number one program right now, and I'm not saying that should be enough for them, but Georgia fans can understandably be very comfortable knowing that they are living through the good old days, and I believe 95% of them recognize that. And while maybe the rest of the college football landscape doesn't give them their flowers, the end of the season when Georgia's celebrating potentially once again, I don't know how much that is going to matter.
Let me ask you another question kind of somewhat related to this. What do you think about ESPN? Because I played the clip of Kirk Herbstreit a moment ago, and to my ears, he sounds sort of hilariously out of touch with the regular pace of the average college football fan. Herbstreit admitting, I haven't started paying attention yet. I don't even know the college football championship odds. But most college football fans, Connor, have been talking about this kind of stuff for months. ESPN has had this monopoly on college football, but I believe they've largely squandered it because they only basically talk about it during the fall. Their college ball voices essentially disappear. Greg McElroy is somewhat changing that a little bit right now because I guess he's doing kind of a permanent thing. But ESPN essentially only covers college football during the fall, despite the fact that it's the second most popular sport in the entire country. And so you got a guy like Kirk Herbstreit who makes like $1 gazillion sort of floating in September, floating out again in January. And listen, I get the fact that he's rich and I get all that kind of stuff. And, he sort of earned the right to work when he wants to work. But when he's the most prominent voice kind of speaking about college football on ESPN, the network that has kind of controlled most of college football for quite some time, I think that to me looks like another dynasty that is on its way to crumbling. It looks like another empire that's on its way to falling. And somehow in the future, I believe that the college football world is going to look a little bit less like the version of the sport that's been controlled and dominated by ESPN. We may see more media rights folks kind of involved in the college football playoff and things like that. I feel like we're in kind of late stage ESPN control of college football. What do you think about that?
So I think there are two separate issues here. We can get to the ESPN part later. With Kirk Herbstreit, do you know what changed with him in the past, I believe, 16 to 18 months?
Well, he's doing the NFL now.
Exactly, and I think that is a big reason why his college football analysis has suffered.
Okay.
And I'll be very frank here. I do not think he's a good NFL analyst. I did not like him on the Amazon games last year. I felt like, and I'm a big NFL fan, felt like every time, when I was watching this guy at Ohio State or I was watching this guy at Alabama, I'm like, he was at Alabama 5 years ago. Like, tell me something about him currently. And
sure.
I feel like, maybe Kirk is spread very thin right now, and he's also recently dealt with some things in his personal life. His son was recently hospitalized, And so, he has, I think, understandably so, been focused on other things. It's just, to me, Kirk Herbstreit is the biggest analyst right now in college football. And the fact that he's splitting time with the NFL, I think that's maybe perhaps my bigger issue. Kirk for so long was the guy that owned college football, was the biggest voice in the sport, and now, he's sort of dabbling between the two with college football and the NFL. And I think it has unquestionably hurt, his voice when it comes to college football in terms of being in tune with that, because you can't do both. You can't focus on the NFL and be great at that and be as great as you are at college football. I think ultimately you're going to have to choose, and look, he chose the money from the NFL, and I get that, and it'd be hard for a lot of people to turn that down. But I think that unquestionably in recent seasons, his analysis has dropped off a bit as he has tried to have his cake and eat it too, so to speak. As far as ESPN, look, it is not a perfect broadcast, partner, I believe, and you and I have talked about this. And look, as an NBA fan, with some of the stuff they have done there, it is not an enjoyable program to watch. And so I think from a larger standpoint, this may be ESPN, trying to have its hands in so many different pots and really, not focusing on what, say, a consumer wants and what, generates these conferences the most money, which is, again, is what they are obligated to do, that they are business partners together. And so I think the other thing, and you kind of touched on this with McElroy, who I like a lot as an analyst, who are the next wave of college football analysts from a national perspective that are up and coming and truly love the sport and speak glowingly about it? For as polarizing as Danny Cannell is for a lot of people, yeah, I think he was unquestionably great for getting people interested in college football, getting people talking about college football.
I think Joel Klatt's like that too. I think that Fox is building Joel Klatt right now to be a better analyst than anything ESPN has.
Yes, and Klatt, at the very least, he is interesting, and he doesn't have those sort of obvious biases. He does, I think, a great job of sort of covering all those bases and being fair and objective on a lot of different issues. With ESPN, who are you building that to be? It could very well be Greg McElroy, a guy I've said I'm a big fan of. I like his analyst style. But who is that going to be? They're trying something with RG3. We'll see if he's able to do that and become that kind of guy. I think, we've unfortunately hit a spot where, and again, this sport's going to change quite a bit more as this goes through a 12-team playoff. And I do think, the television rights, when they come open in 2026, I think you're going to see Fox probably get more involved in this, maybe a CBS, maybe an NBC. I think ESPN and some of this, some of those color analysts have been in their position for so long that, it kind of gets hard to get new voices into this sport. But, a guy who used to, I think, be great, Booger McFarland, he goes to the NFL. He's no longer, I think, the same voice that he has in college football as he sort of tries to split the two. So I think the big thing with ESPN and maybe the criticism that I would have for them, have your dedicated NFL analysts and have your dedicated college analysts, but don't try and cross them over and have them, I think, dilute both products in those circumstances. Dan Orlovsky, I think, is a really good NFL analyst. I'm not a fan of his from a college perspective. I don't necessarily want to see him on my television on Saturdays calling games. If in the event that I'm not at a Georgia game.
So let me just finish with this, and I'm an unabashed SEC homer, and I've expressed this opinion before. It concerns me that the SEC is so intertwined with ESPN going forward, because what ESPN essentially is, not to get into like the Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal type stuff here, but ESPN is essentially a very large failed business. It is, it generates, billions in revenue, but it's essentially it's not a profitable business anymore. And I think some of the decisions they're making are possibly a reason why. It concerns me that the ESPN family of networks is going to be so intertwined with the SEC in comparison to the Big Ten, the SEC's chief competition, who I just think has a better collection of TV partners or media rights partners, if you want to use more modern, phrasing here. As an SEC homer, I'm a little bit concerned with how intertwined the SEC is going to be with ESPN, because I'm not quite so sure that's a good business partnership moving forward.
Can I push back there a little bit?
Please.
Georgia, Florida. Biggest game of the season for Georgia, or at least on an annual basis. Big game. You would agree with that, correct?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And you do a lot of work on Friday nights now. How would you feel about that game being at noon?
I mean, it'd be harder to get there for sure. But I mean, look, I obviously have loved that game being on at 3:30, but I would also credit CBS for the reason why it's had the prime time that it's had. CBS has been a good partner for Georgia, Florida in all these years.
Look, ESPN, again, is not perfect. I think all of these broadcast companies have areas they could certainly do better in. For CBS, as good as the production value is, one, those games take way too long to be completed, and secondly, I know you're at all the games now, and I usually am. Unfortunately, I was not able to be at the Tennessee game last year. Listening to Gary Danielson is real tough. And so I think you can find and pick nits. The fact that, Fox's biggest game is always at noon, I think that's a drawback for fans. I think some of these games deserve to be played in prime time. Again, ESPN isn't perfect. The idea that going forward we're going to start, getting 7:30, 8 o'clock kickoffs that can build the entire day to these mega games, I think is going to be something that is very much something to look forward to. And, again, I understand the criticisms of that. I don't necessarily believe that the grass is going to be greener at other, broadcast partners. And let's point out here, a big reason, perhaps the biggest reason, that the SEC went from CBS to just ESPN, ABC, Disney, was that the contract that the SEC had with CBS was a complete and total joke for what that game and what those rights should have been going for. And the SEC, because of that, is still trying to play catch up to what the Big Ten has with their media rights. And so while I understand, you might want to push there against ESPN, the SEC is not without blame here, in my opinion.
Fair enough, Connor. Really good stuff. I appreciate you being here. We'll look forward to reading more from you at DawgNation.com. And just thanks, as always, for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
As always, it's a pleasure, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
And look, I realize that not every fan cares about any of the media stuff. I realize that for a lot of fans, all they care about the games on the field. That's all that matters to them. I will give you one word of caution, though, one word of warning moving forward, is that I believe in the way that college football gets talked about in the future, it is going to be impossible to kind of unwind Georgia SEC from its media rights partner and the Big Ten from its media rights partners there as well, because why is right now the SEC, the Big Ten, the two biggest leagues far distancing themselves from the ACC, the Pac-12, and the Big 12 to the point in which it's not even obvious that all three of those other Power 5 leagues will even exist moving forward? What is the difference here? It's the relationship those leagues have with their media partners. That the thing that fuels the sport right now is money, and the money is provided by the media partners. So in some form or fashion, ESPN doesn't just televise SEC games moving forward, and Fox doesn't just televise Big Ten games moving forward. They are essentially partners in producing the SEC or the Big Ten product. And so, in terms of how you fuel your favorite team and how you fuel those victories and how you fuel the competition that exists around your favorite team, in this case Georgia, that's going to be intertwined with the media rights stuff from here going forward. And the business of college football, now that it's kind of unabashedly and no one makes any kind of apologies for the fact this is absolutely viewed as a business, the way in which the business is funded is just going to get more attention, and that is the media rights stuff, which means the actions of ESPN, the way in which they choose to cover the sport, and the way in which they choose to kind of provide a platform for the sport, that is going to matter moving forward, and I think that ESPN deserves some scrutiny here. So we'll obviously be there to do that. It is now time to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And I got to tell you, I had a great time on my own Royal Caribbean cruise vacation this past weekend. And I did. This is one of those things where we want to do this for my mom for Christmas, and he had those plans, those months and months of getting ready for it. And I just really felt like it worked out exactly as we kind of hoped that it would. I've got two kids. My brother and his wife, they have two kids. Watching, the four of them playing with each other all weekend and just running around on the ship and doing all that kind of stuff. It was just such a great thing to be able to see and to be able to share that with my mom and, provide that for her. Just one of those things that I think we were all just really, really proud to have been a part of and to have shared in and to have done that. And I'm just so thankful that Royal Caribbean cruises exist, going to provide that moment for me and my family kind of connect together. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to kind of invite you to do the same thing, because I'm I can tell you, I am a very satisfied customer. I was on board Independence of the Seas this weekend. That's the same cruise that we took for our DawgNation cruise back in April, and it's just fun. Now, listen, we had 9 people on board the ship from our family here. That's a lot of schedules to kind of get coordinated, things like that. So really for us right now, a 3-day cruise was about the only time we could kind of find those dates to do that. Everybody kind of coordinated, everybody kind of getting together. But for you, maybe it's a 4-day cruise. That's what the DawgNation cruise was. We left on Monday, came back on Friday. Our cruise is a little bit more of a shorter weekend type thing. You can also take the 7-day cruise. You can do a longer cruise than that if you really want to. Whatever option is out there for you, our friend Jessica Slater, a good travel agent, can help you find it. 770-718-9147. 770-718-9147. You can call her on that. You can also visit our website, royaldogs.com. That is a website that she has put together that not only educates you about what Royal Caribbean offers, but specifically the DawgNation cruise coming up in April of 2024. You've heard me talking about that, folks. It is time to get going on the DawgNation cruise, bigger and better than it's ever been before, on board Allure of the Seas, on an Oasis-class ship. The DawgNation cruise gets even bigger and better for 2024. We can't wait for all of that. So we'll see you then for that. For now, though, let's go cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And last night, I have to say, now, listen, this is one of those things where I saw some of this. I'm not going to lie to you. I did not see a ton of the final series, the College World Series, because I'm kind of en route and traveling, and you're kind of bouncing around. We actually went to Playmaker. This is not an ad. This is true. We went to Playmaker Sports Bar on board Independence of the Seas on one of the nights we were on board. We actually watched the really fun extra innings game. I guess those would have been game 1 of the College World Series final, where LSU beat Florida. I know Florida came storming back to win game 2 in impressive fashion, and those Gators fans, they thought they were on the verge of a national championship, because after all, Florida fans aren't like these redneck Georgia fans only care about football. Florida fans care about all the sports. They want to be good at all the sports. But guess what? They emotionally bought into their baseball team last night, and they got disappointed because LSU wiped them up off the turf there in Omaha and won the national championship. So congratulations to Wes Johnson. Now Georgia head baseball coach, already getting acclimated to what things are around here, which is fun to beating up on those lousy, stinking Gators. Wes Johnson was a part of the LSU team that did that. So that's a great way to welcome him in to start his new tenure as Georgia baseball coach, as LSU takes care of Florida, kicks them around, beats them up, wins the national championship. We are not LSU fans, but we are fans of anybody who's beaten up on the lousy, stinking Gators. So that includes LSU for us. So we'll give a quick hold that tiger for them on that as they take care of Florida, and Florida fans make the long, sad trip from Omaha back to Gainesville without any kind of championship to show for their appearance in the College World Series. Because, boy, for a while there, they thought they were going to win it. But ultimately, just as much disappointment for them in baseball as exists for them in all the other sports, and we certainly love that. On a slightly different note, I mentioned Joel Klatt a little earlier. Joel Klatt recently did a very interesting interview with SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey. And Klatt posed an interesting question to Sankey in this interview about whether or not that Greg Sankey thinks of himself as the most influential figure in college football right now. And Sankey, I want to read the answer that Sankey gave here. He says, no, I think I'm in a role that creates a level of influence or creates a platform. I like to think I've been effective on some issues, but if I was to either accept or seek that kind of definition, I think I would be chasing the wrong thing. I think it's the product of the work on a day-to-day basis. I have to be effective in my work. I have to be in a place that has permanence and then provides influence. I think that's a byproduct rather than the center of who I am or what I do. One of the things I find very interesting about Greg Sankey is I think he chooses his words carefully, and I don't think he's afraid to kind of throw a zinger when he needs to. Now, some of the stuff that he's kind of done in the past, I'm not quite so sure matters to me all that much. The idea that the SEC adding Texas and Oklahoma was better than the Big Ten adding UCLA and USC because of the fact that there's not as much geographic difference between Texas and Oklahoma as there is for the two LA schools joining the Big Ten. Ultimately, I'm not quite sure how much that kind of stuff matters. But Greg Sankey in that statement right there used, I believe, a very important word. He talked about the word permanence. And this to me really does matter. And this is one of the reasons why I do think that Greg Sankey is the most influential figure in college football, whether he wants to be or not. Is that Greg Sankey does appear to be in this for the long haul. For better or worse, he does appear to be a lifer in college athletics, in the SEC in particular. And therefore, for those of us who care about college athletics, the version of the sports, football, baseball, basketball, things like that, the versions of the sports that we've enjoyed in the past, our hope that those things last into the future, I think in some form or fashion, Greg Sankey probably is our best hope to ensure those things continue to exist in the same way. That's not a guarantee that Sankey's going to make all the right decisions, because frankly, I'm not so sure that he's going to, because these are tough choices that may have to be made in the future. But I think that Sankey is our best hope for leadership, because what Sankey says he has is something other folks have sort of shown that they don't have. Sankey talks about permanence. Guess what? That's not what Kevin Warren had. The Big Ten commissioner, more than happy to kind of turn all of college athletics on its side, bringing in USC, UCLA, not to mention the disgraceful behavior back during the 2020 year when he was seemingly hell-bent on canceling a season that didn't need to be canceled. Kevin Warren made all of those decisions with really kind of a level of short-term thinking. Warren's no longer involved in college athletics. He's now the president of the Chicago Bears. Apparently, he had no interest in dedicating, devoting his life to college athletics, but was more than happy to use the Big Ten like a plaything while he was the league's commissioner, making seismic changes to college athletics because he could. And, sometimes, doing something because you can't. What's the line from Jurassic Park? You're so busy trying to decide if you could, you didn't figure out if you should. Well, it seems like some of the stuff that Kevin Warren did as Big Ten commissioner was an example of the kind of short-term thinking that someone participates in when they don't plan on being a permanent part of college athletics. I have very little respect for Warren for some of the things that he did in the Big Ten. His absence in college football is sort of an example of, good riddance. But the things that he did on the basis of the short-term thinking while he was here, I think it created some real problems. And I think that Sankey being more of a permanent part of college athletics does, in this case, make him better. The other guy you'll mention sort of in the same vein is a guy like Jack Swarbrick. That was the former Notre Dame athletic director. Notre Dame's not in a conference. They are a big brand in college athletics, so therefore Swarbrick has kind of always had a seat at the table for any of these deliberations that have gone on about the future of college athletics. But Swarbrick himself has now announced that he's retiring. He is stepping down. Another guy that has made some big decisions as of late without planning on being a part of the fruits of those decisions over the course of the long haul. Greg Sankey is just different. Now, does different make him better? I think we're about to find out. Sankey's going to have to lead through some very tumultuous stuff coming up in the future, because all the change we have seen in college athletics, as you know, there is even more change on the way in the future. And there's going to be some right decisions that could be made or some wrong decisions that need to be avoided. And I hope that Sankey leads well throughout all of this. But there's no doubt that he is the influential guy here. To go back to 2020, when everybody else wanted to cancel the season, Greg Sankey was a leader in saying there is another way. Sankey was proven right on all of that. And I hope he can be proven right again as more tough decisions are going to be made in the future. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So happy to be back in the chair again, doing the show again, and happy to have all of you on board with us there as well. And most of you coming off a fun weekend in your own right, whether you're on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation or not. In fact, let's give you an example of that with our golden shoe here today. How about AJ Hood sharing this? You got the smoker cranked up there. You got some good-looking, looks like a steak getting ready to go on the grill there. That's very nice. And, of course, some finished long drink right there to go along with it. AJ saying, I'm, quote, finishing the week off right. Boy, AJ, it sounds like you're having a good time doing that with our friends at the Finished Long Drink. Always pairing great with an outdoor cookout or some steaks on the grill, whatever you got going on. The Finished Long Drink pairs great with that. You better believe that. So, AJ, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for sharing it with us. Wish you had shared some of that beef and long drink with us. That would have been good, too. But we'll give you a golden shoe nonetheless. How about those lousy, stinking Gators? Big loser in baseball. Big loser in football. 123 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater countdown. We will see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The prices promise. You can trust them on all of that. And I'm glad to be talking to you again, folks. I hope you were good while I was gone. Hope you behaved in this comment section while I wasn't here. But we're happy that you're here nonetheless. And we'll get ready to get talking to you about it all. All right, let's see what's going on in here. A lot of folks talking about cruising in here right now. Let's see what else. Yeah, a lot of folks in here talking about cruising. Nature Gator says, I wonder if BA would have said anything on here if Florida had won last night. That's not fair, Nature. We gave Florida credit for some recruiting success last week. We said they should have been doing that, years ago, but nonetheless, we gave them some credit for that. We gave credit to Florida for making the College World Series. Of course, we would have mentioned that. But, listen, we always think that this brief success for Florida is just simply a setup for a letdown, and that was once again proven true again last night. Let's see what else. UGA boy for life, Brunetti, not happy with ESPN. Yeah, I mean, I do think scrutinizing the way in which this entity chooses to cover the SEC is going to matter because, we talked before. We're going to do something on this tomorrow, not so much related to ESPN, but related to, like, Michigan and the fact that, Reese Davis has said he thinks that Michigan will be his number one team. How many of the people on Big Noon Saturday for Fox are going to pick Georgia to win the national championship? My guess is they probably show a little bit of loyalty to their brand. And my guess is you don't get the same kind of thing in return from ESPN when it comes to the SEC. That's my guess anyway. Let's see what else. Scrolling back here through the YouTube to see what people are talking about. Enrique Isidoro says if Herbie is right, Georgia would not have won anything. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue with the Herbstreit stuff, too, is like doubling down on an opinion that's essentially factually wrong. Like one of the things that I was going to mention, didn't have time to, was if you want to go back to January when ESPN's collection of sports writers kind of did their first sort of early look at the 2023 season, like about 80% of the people that wrote, at least 80%, the overwhelming majority for sure, all had Alabama in this year's playoffs. So the idea that everybody was counting Alabama out, that's just sort of factually incorrect. They're going to be a very highly rated preseason team. And, the idea that no one was doubting Georgia a year ago, that's something else that Herbstreit was sort of spewing the other day when really almost no one was picking Georgia to win the national championship last season. So it's not just that people, I think, in this particular case disagree with Kirk Herbstreit's opinion. I think you also have a situation where a lot of folks are kind of pointing out what appear to be factual inaccuracies. BA's Ty Stone Cold Style says ESPN's going to be hiring from YouTube in 2024. And I think that's also kind of the point here is, like, as I said before, hopefully I'm pretty humble and, I don't go around tooting my own horn very much. Maybe I don't have much to toot it over, but either way, try to not do that. But way back in 2015, the plan that we had for DawgNation Daily when we started it was this idea that you could do college football talk every single day because the people that kind of had control of this stuff weren't doing it enough. And you could provide an outlet for fans to discuss their favorite sport because Georgia fans don't stop being Georgia fans in June. At least the overwhelming majority of them don't. You look at overall show numbers, our numbers don't change that much. We have almost as many people tuning in June, July, May, April. What kind of people think of as the dead of off season, the part of the time that a guy like Kirk Herbstreit's not paying attention to college football. We have almost as many people tuning in on a day like this. Once you kind of count for all the people that consume it after the fact, which is like 99% of the audience. We have almost as many people consuming our product now as we will in September, October, November. That's just kind of the way it's always been. And we kind of identified that as a hole in the market. We sort of identified a market in the hole, as the saying goes. And we created something that ESPN just didn't have the foresight to create. They had the entire monopoly on all of college football, but they were essentially squandering. They weren't using it to their advantage. They were talking about all these other sports, and they were like endlessly hyping these other sports that are just measurably less popular than college football is. And I'll never understand why ESPN has spent so much time trying to make other sports as popular as college football without leaning on the popularity of college football. I'll never understand that. But when you watch Stephen A. Smith or the shows they have on during the day, they're not screaming about college football this time of year. They're screaming about something else. And it's just mind-boggling. It's befuddling that ESPN, that's essentially controlled all of college football, is content to ignore college football until the season starts. That's crazy to me. Let's see what else. Frank Batterson says, that one sad thing about Dylan Raiola moving to Buford is there's some kid there that's been with his friends since kindergarten. Now they won't get to play with him this season. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm sure there's always, more than one side to every story. And, anytime there's like a move-in situation with, a high school situation like that, there's always going to be someone that's kind of displaced through all of that. And I do hate that. I do. I don't know that in every situation, broadly speaking, I'm in favor of the kind of transfer move-in culture that sort of exists across high school football in all states, Georgia included. I do like the idea, and every now and then you'll kind of talk to a coach, and he'll have to be one of the things he brags on. It's like, hey, we don't have move-ins here. Our guys have been together since, like you said, kindergarten, whatever else. And I think there's something that's kind of nice about that when the high school team does fully represent the community. I think there's something really nice about that. But in the case of Dylan, selfishly, I want him to play the toughest competition he can play going into a time at Georgia. And 7-on-7 ain't it. Hey, throw this football and hit this target, that ain't it. Having the kind of defenses that you'll face when you play the likes of a Marietta or a North Cobb or somebody like that, having those kind of defenses chasing you down, that's how you find out what kind of player you are right now. And I'm just a big believer that players play. And, if you want to kind of find out what kind of competitor you can be, you can't really find that out about yourself until you are forced to compete. And you're just not getting that level of competition in Arizona. You're just not. I know Pinnacle's a good program out there. I get that. But the overall level of competition just isn't the same. It's just not. And so, admittedly, I'm going to look at this through the narrow lens of what benefits Dylan Raiola personally, individually. And I think playing against better competition, and by the way, taking some lumps along the way. Dylan may end up being the best player in the state this year, but y'all, he is not going to just sort of tiptoe through the tulips all year long. That is going to be a tough challenge against the kind of teams he'll be facing, even with the talent that Buford has. Buford didn't win the state championship in 7A last year. If Dylan gets to the state championship this year, he could very well be competing against Julian Lewis, who may be, just as good of a prospect, if not better, a couple of years younger. That he may be facing against a quarterback who is of a similar stature in a state championship situation, or wherever it would be that Carrollton and Buford would match up in the playoffs, depending on how the brackets kind of line up. Not obvious they'd play in the state championship necessarily. I mean, you're going to find out a lot about yourself when you're competing against a higher level of competition. Nature Gator does ask a fair question, which is true, that Buford has primarily been a running football team. And if you do care about like the Georgia high school football angle of this, how much is that offense going to change now with Dylan Raiola at quarterback? Obviously, you'd assume it changes a pretty good bit. But even you go back and look a year ago, when they had Justice at running back, they were rotating him. They were playing him some, playing their other guys, because they had backup running backs who were very good too. Like Buford doesn't really – they didn't certainly build their entire team around Justice Haynes a year ago. And so you kind of wonder how much they're going to kind of change for Dylan Raiola here this year. I think it's a fair question. Let me go to Facebook here for a minute. Let's see what else. Alan Verbanchik points out that Michigan returns 84% of last year's production. Yeah. So my plan is to talk about Michigan a little bit more tomorrow. We just didn't have time to do this today, but there's some interesting stuff out there. There's some more stuff out there on Michigan that I kind of want to get to. Miriam Corbin says, I just hope that Dylan Raiola doesn't get hurt. And I understand where Miriam's coming from on that. Obviously, you don't want, guys to get hurt. Georgia's kind of dealt with that with some of their, high school seniors dealing with some injuries over the years. But ultimately, I'm more interested in just sort of competing in football and letting players play and letting the chips fall where they may. In other words, if you gave me the choice right now of all the players that Georgia is going to sign for this 2024 recruiting class, if I could wrap them in bubble wrap right now and not have them play their senior year to guarantee and ensure they were healthy when they arrived at Georgia, I wouldn't want to do it. I really wouldn't. If Dylan Raiola goes all out and plays in a state like Georgia, if they make a march through the playoffs, that's a lot of football against tough football teams. Raiola could get hurt. But I believe not competing hurts you worse. I really do. There's a risk associated with injury when you play football. But when you shy away from playing football, there is an even bigger risk, I believe, in terms of the right mindset to play. In other words, if Dylan had stayed in Arizona facing the prospect of not playing for 5 games, he very easily could have packed it in and been like, okay, well, I'll be on my team, come 5 games in, but maybe I don't want to like risk injury for just 5 games. Maybe I'll just count my senior year as a wash, go to Georgia in December, and I'll be there ready to start practices prior to the bowl games. Like, is that what you want Dylan Raiola to do if he were to truly have to sit out those first 5 games? Had he stayed in Arizona, I would say no. I'd say no. Now, if Dylan takes a bad shot to the knee and gets hurt, some of y'all will throw this back in my face. But even understanding the risk, I'm telling you right now, I want players to play. I want players to compete. I want players to learn what it feels like to fight against someone who is your equal. Because I think there is something that you learn about yourself when you're in that situation that you don't learn if you're pushing around someone who's just not as good as you. I just think that's the way that it goes. And so Dylan voluntarily inviting himself to enter into a tougher competitive environment, I think that says something really good about him. I do. Miriam says, I absolutely wanted to play. I'm just a worrywart. Yeah, I understand that, Miriam. I do. Brandon Griffin says, I think that Carson Beck is flying under everyone's radar. Brandon, I think there's a chance that what you're saying is right. And I touched on this on one of the vacation shows we did last week, that ultimately I'm not quite so sure what kind of year that Beck has, but I do think that, and this is the same thing was true with Stetson Bennett a year ago too, that people were so fixated on Georgia's future at quarterback, they were kind of moving past the present. And Bennett, when a lot of folks thought, well, he just ride off in the sunset in 2021, and now you'll look to 2022 for something different, Bennett was like, actually, I'm not quite ready to leave yet. It's not obvious that Carson Beck won't make a similar decision, use a double negative. But, I mean, the idea that a lot of Georgia fans sort of think of Beck as this kind of one-and-done phenomenon because they're curious about what comes next after Carson Beck, and they don't want to lose any of the quarterbacks that they have. Carson Beck is going to make the best decisions for him. And if Carson really balls out this year, my guess is that Georgia won't be in a big hurry for him to leave, no matter who's coming in behind him. Matt Rukavine also reminding us of the Desmond Howard playoff picks from a year ago, which are probably the worst. Listen, I've had some doozies. If you want to really go back and unearth the archives here, you could find some horrible takes from me over the years, I'm guessing. But I don't know that anything's quite as bad as Desmond Howard's playoff picks from a year ago. Miriam also wanted to know about a DawgNation invasion. Yeah, Miriam, let me get on that. Let's find out if we got anything coming on that. Richard Dees asked a good question. What's Georgia's weakest link for the upcoming season and the strongest? I would say strongest, it might be offensive line. Georgia may be the strongest at the offensive line. Is there any other position group that you would say is obviously better than that? Inside linebackers you could maybe say, but Smile's a little bit banged up right now, and that's only 2 guys, right? If you want to count all linebackers together, you could maybe say that too. But I believe the offensive line may be the overall strongest part about Georgia, which makes everything better, right? Everything benefits from being a good offensive line. Now, if you said overall on paper, what is the biggest concern? I think you'd probably either say injury situation at running back or the fact that you have a totally inexperienced quarterback. If you're, we just talked about Carson Beck for the positive. Let's do the flip side of that for a moment. That Beck does begin this season as a guy with very little experience. Now, what people have seen from him, they think they like. G-Day, brief flashes, late game a year ago. But Beck essentially has 0 experience. And so, and we talked about this a couple of, month or so ago, that at some point in time, you're going to put him into a road game situation for the very first time. You're going to kind of find out how he performs there. That a team like Georgia is going to be number 1 for a reason. And whether the talking heads on ESPN catch up to this or not, they're going to be, from a point spread standpoint, a gambling standpoint, they're going to be viewed as a pretty large favorite to win the national championship. But even a team like that's got its concerns. Even a team like that's got its question marks. And I would say the two biggest are how healthy are the Georgia running backs? Is there a guy or a tandem of guys or a group of guys ready to step to the forefront there? And, how quickly can Carson Beck kind of get comfortable as the Georgia starting quarterback when he's facing someone other than his own teammates? I think that's fair. Randy Hall says, what about tight end as the strongest position group? Yeah, I mean, you can certainly make the case. Obviously, Brock Bowers, I believe, is the best player in college football, but it's also an example of kind of like inside linebacker where at the most you've only got 2 tight ends on the field usually. So a position like offensive line where you really got 5 guys on the field, for Georgia to have, I think potential All-American level players like Cedric Von Prawn and Amarius Mims there to go along with, very solid starters like a Tate Ratledge and I believe in Ernest Green. And I just think the overall combination of very impressive prospects compared with seasoned veterans, I think that makes that a very, very tough group to deal with. I do. Let me go back around the other comment sections here for a little bit. Frederick Meredith says the Georgia defensive line is going to be awesome. No concerns there. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Trey Scott feels very good about what he has this year. And, obviously Jalen Carter stepped in and became a very important part of Georgia's late season push, but Jalen also didn't play for a long time last year. So, Georgia got pretty comfortable playing without Jalen Carter earlier in the year. Now, when Carter stepped in, he dominated. He dominated. But it's not like these guys haven't played without Jalen Carter before. Frank Patterson says our running backs have sprained ankles. Why does DawgNation, everyone else, talk like our running back room is coming back from ACL, spinal cord, or brain injury type stuff? He says Milton's the only one who gets hurt often. Yeah, I think the only thing that I would say, Frank, is, now I can't really speak to what other people have said. I think the only thing that I would say is that of all the stuff that we kind of think about with Georgia football, this was just the one thing we didn't see in spring. We didn't see a lot from the Georgia running back. So, and you're not comparing this to the typical college football situation. You're comparing this to the other Georgia position groups where I think you saw enough from wide receiver. You have enough returning production there that right now that group would rank ahead of the Georgia running backs. Tight end, fewer guys in the field, but because of the fact you got a Brock Bowers, that ranks ahead of the Georgia running backs, the defensive position groups, for various reasons. In terms of more of a sure thing, more of a sure bet, you'd have to rank those there. So why does the Georgia running back situation get spoken about as a question mark? Part of that is because you're comparing it to the other Georgia position groups, which are all, I think, undeniably, unquestionably strong. And the Georgia running back situation, therefore, just has more questions because the other position groups we would otherwise discuss just have so few questions. And in the case of like Milton, who has dealt with some injuries and dealt with one this spring, the conversation around Kendall is not so much, can he finally be healthy? It's, can he finally be healthy and also take the reins as the leading running back? In other words, even if Kendall had been healthy during spring, I believe there would rightly so still be questions asked of, is he ready to be kind of a lead dog running back for this Georgia, team this year? That would still be a question. Branson Robinson showed you flashes a year ago, but it would still be right to ask, okay, well, what about an expanded role here this year? Is he ready for more of that this year? A lot of Georgia fans would say, I know Frank loves the running back position. A lot of Georgia fans would say, yeah, he definitely is. But there's still an element of, growing into something that he hasn't been before. And the other thing is, because Andrew Paul, I think, that was a more serious injury. That's not just an ankle or something like that. It was an injury that took place a year ago. But you're still on a recovery timeline for him where he's not going to be as healthy now as he will be a year from now. And so, when you look at Dejon Edwards and Kendall Milton and Branson Robinson, not to be, negative here, but you're also one running back injury away from feeling a little thinner at the running back spot than you kind of want to, if you get my drift. Nature Gator says the state of Florida has 4 teams in the top 10 of the final high school football rankings. Man, I don't care about these national rankings. That doesn't mean anything to me. Brandon Griffin says, if we win again, does that make Brock Bowers the greatest dog of all time? I don't think you can be better than Herschel Walker is. I just think that Herschel Walker is this sort of like Babe Ruth type figure that he was just so dominant during his era that I'd have a hard time believing that Brock Bowers could eclipse what Herschel Walker did at Georgia. I mean, Herschel Walker just, I think if anything, we're losing touch with how good Herschel Walker was. I tried to touch on this the other day carefully because it's a little bit of a sensitive subject, but I think we're losing touch with how good Herschel Walker was. I think there are some people that kind of want to erase Herschel Walker as a college football figure, and I just think that's such a mistake. I don't care what you think about politics. I honestly don't. I really, really don't. But Herschel Walker's career has to be properly appreciated, and I worry that it's kind of not. It's either being misunderstood by people who weren't old enough to live through it, or it's being intentionally erased by people who just don't want Herschel Walker to be a part of the conversation. But Herschel Walker, I believe, is the greatest player of all time. And that's why, like some people want to kind of put Stetson Bennett in that category with Herschel Walker in Georgia football history. And I just don't think you can do it. Stetson Bennett is a historic figure in some respects, but he is not on par with Herschel Walker. He's not. Because, it's not even obvious that Stetson Bennett was the best player on the Georgia team the last couple of years. In fact, I believe that Brock Bowers was, to go back to your point, and there may have been guys on defense who were also better than Stetson there as well. So it would then seem incorrect to me to put Bennett and Walker equally when Bennett wasn't even the best player, arguably, on his own team these last 2 years. Where if you want to go back to the Herschel Walker era, with no disrespect to anybody else who was in those teams, no one was in Herschel's universe in terms of how good he was on those teams. But Bowers could come close. I think that Brock Bowers has been, over the course of these 2 years, putting together a phenomenal, historic career. And when you look at how good he was as a freshman, by the end of the year, I believe he'd even taken the next step as a sophomore. What's possible and available to him here as a junior. I said last week, I think that Brock Bowers as a tight end could win the Heisman Trophy. As crazy as that sounds, it seems impossible. We haven't had a tight end win the award since the 1940s. As crazy as all that sounds, I think that Bowers could do it. And so therefore, I think you're putting him in that sort of Mount Rushmore conversation of the 2 or 3 best players in Georgia football history. Bowers would be very, very close to Herschel Walker there, but I have a hard time seeing him eclipsing Herschel Walker. But better than Frank Sinkwich, better than Charlie Trippi, better than these other names that typically come up. Yeah, I believe that Bowers absolutely has a chance to kind of eclipse a lot of those big, bold print names. I think that Bowers has a chance to move past a lot of those, and I think in some respects he's already on his way to doing that. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says if Herschel Walker played in modern times, he probably would have won 3 Heisman trophies. Yeah, I mean, look, it's just easier to run the football now than it used to be. It just is. When you got defenses spread out from pillar to post, y'all, it's just easier to run the ball. Herschel Walker was doing it in a time in which everybody in the building knew he was going to get it, and he still went out and dominated. He just did. Paul Moon says freshmen and sophomores just didn't win back then. They really didn't. I mean, it's just a fact. Enrique Isidro says that Walker's status as a football player is a victim of erosion with time. I think that's also true, that not everything about Walker's diminished status has been like nefarious, right? I think Enrique's right, that some of this is just sort of the natural passing of time, that over the course of time, football has changed so much. I mean, I'm sitting here in my 40s. I'm not even old enough to have seen Herschel Walker really play. So anybody who's younger than me has no living memory of that at all. So some of this is just the natural passing of time. The same way that, by the time that Michael Jordan was dominating basketball, people had forgotten about Bill Russell. By the time that Joe Montana was dominating in football, people had forgotten about Johnny Unitas. That there is sort of a natural erosion of time where I think some people sort of forget. But I think it's also the job of people who kind of do what I do for a living, try to prevent that from happening. Especially when, in addition to kind of the natural erosion of memory over time, I believe there's also, in addition to that, an intentional erasure of Herschel Walker. When you've got both those things going on, all the more reason for people, even people who, by the way, disagree with his politics, because there's obviously a large portion of our audience that disagrees with his politics. But even with the people who disagree with his politics, I think there's still an obligation to say, yeah, but you can't say anything about his football career. And I think it's got to be as simple as that. You can like his politics, you can dislike his politics, but revering him properly as a player, I think that's a responsibility of all Georgia fans. Let's do one more spin through the comment section. Frederick Meredith says, I'm 55, and I remember Herschel Walker like it all happened last week. Yeah, listen, Frederick, I my things would be different than that, but there are a lot of things from my time coming up which seem very, very prominent in my mind now, even though the calendar would tell me happened a long time ago. Boy, it doesn't seem that way. Let's see what else. DT says Herschel is the greatest college football player of all time. Totally agree with BA. I had season tickets to his UGA career. He was so far better than anyone on the field. Yeah, I mean, it's worth kind of revisiting some of those highlights if you weren't quite old enough to have seen those. And a lot of them are really cool. They really hold up well. That he wasn't just sort of the 3 yards in a cloud of dust style running back. I mean, he's jumping over piles, flipping, landing on his feet, and taking off. I mean, it's quite a show. Quite a show for sure. Roger Hall says that Brock Bowers would be on the Georgia Mount Rushmore along with Herschel and Stetson Bennett. Yeah, we did our Mount Rushmore stuff back in February. We just had some fun with that. I had Bowers on mine. I had Herschel on mine. I also included David Pollock on mine. I think that Pollock had a great career at a time in which Georgia football really mattered. Early 2000s. I think some of this is kind of respecting those eras. And the early 2000s era was a very important era for Georgia football, and David Pollock was a very, very big part of that. Let me go back to Facebook for a moment. We're going to get ready to wrap up here in a moment. A couple more comments. Stanley Keaton says, Herschel Walker won the national championship the year I graduated from Bainbridge. He says Kirby Smart was still just a little kid. Yeah, that's exactly right. By the way, Kirby recently had some good stuff. We played some of that podcast stuff the other day of Kirby kind of talking with one of those like sports psychologist type trainers they've worked with. He had some good stuff on growing up in Bainbridge and stuff like that with his dad. Probably worth going back and revisiting some of that. I know Mike wrote some of that for Father's Day. It was good stuff. Barry Watkins says, for me, Stetson's in front of Herschel. And I get the temptation to want to do that. After all, quarterback is the most important position. And, Georgia won 2 national championships with Stetson. I do get all of that. And hopefully my credentials as a fan of Stetson Bennett's are well established. I was a pretty big defender of Stetson at a time when that wasn't so in vogue. So hopefully my credentials as a pro Stetson guy are well established. But the knock for me, and listen, Barry's a great Georgia fan. He's got strong opinions and well-reasoned takes when it comes to Georgia football. But the knock for me on Stetson in comparison to Herschel is that there were at least a couple, maybe more players on the Georgia roster the last 2 years that you maybe would have said were better players than Stetson Bennett. The importance of the quarterback position gave Bennett some outsized value. I'll grant you that. But there were still a handful of players that I think you would say, measurably, objectively, that guy's probably better than Stetson, whereas no one would have been that way on the Herschel era. Yeah, so Zach Adams got the same thing, that Herschel was almost a one-man army by himself. Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of what it appeared that he was at times. Kevin Cook says that Herschel should have won the Heisman as a true freshman. Yeah, that would have been the year that George Rogers won it. Is that right? Obviously, Herschel beat Rogers head-to-head that year, I guess. Philip Jordan Wells asking the big questions. What happened to the Plinko game? Drew Carey barely plays anymore. Have they stopped doing the Plinko game on The Price is Right? I was brief departure from the normal commentary. So I saw the day where Pat Sajak is going to stop doing the Price is Right, and I've sort of reached the age now where there are only a handful of things left in my life that have always been true. And if you're younger than me, you may have a lot of those things that, as long as I've been alive, this has been true, and that's been true, that's been true. If you're a little bit older than me, you have probably now lost all of the things that you would say have kind of always been true. But in my life, as long as I can remember, not as long as I've been alive, but as long as I can remember, Pat Sajak has been hosting The Price is Right. I remember being a tiny child. I remember being a tiny child, and Pat Sajak was on TV doing The Price is Right. As long as I've been a sports fan, Jim Boeheim's been the Syracuse basketball coach, and he still is, right? Isn't Boeheim still the Syracuse coach? I think he still is. I don't follow the sport quite as closely as I used to, but I believe Jim Boeheim's still at Syracuse. Coach K just stepped down from Duke. He'd been the Duke coach as long as I'd been following sports. We're kind of running out of those things that have sort of always been true. That's why when, say, Larry Munson stopped doing the Georgia football games, that's one of those things that for most of us had been true for our entire life, and now it wasn't true anymore. And it's always a little bit disconcerting when things that have always been true stop being true. So I don't quite know how I got there from Philip's comment, but I did think about that. Zach Adams says, I know you watched Florida lose the World Series. It was sweeter than a chocolate sundae on a hot summer day. Yes, it was. Yes, it was, Zach. It sure was. Rebel Wally says, no, he's not, LOL. Is that in relationship to me saying Boeheim is still the Syracuse coach, right? Maybe he's referencing something else. I think Jim Boeheim still is at Syracuse, isn't he? But yes, Zach, to your point, yeah, a chocolate sundae on a hot summer day, that was certainly a very, very enjoyable thing to see take place. Lynn Johnson Shipman says, it's always been true that the Gators stink. That's one of those things that never changes, Lynn. You're right about that, and I like that. All right, a couple more comments. We're going to get ready to go because I got to go. Keith Dawg says, Tony Dorsett was and is my favorite all-time college player. Did Dorsett play against Georgia in the 76 Sugar Bowl? Did Dorsett play in that game? Is that right? That was also a good trivia question. Who had this trivia question? That he ended his season. There was a cool trivia question of the day that involved Tony Dorsett and Georgia, and I forget what it was. No, it's one of our cruise questions. That's what it was. So we had a big cruise trivia contest. One of those questions was about Tony Dorsett, that he somebody had the first game of his career and the last game of his career against Georgia, something like that. But Dorsett would have played Georgia in the 76 Sugar Bowl. Is that right? Yeah. Georgia, I guess, played Pitt twice in that era. And that's back when Pitt was good, and they handled Georgia pretty rough both times. So yeah. DT says the anticipation for the George Rogers game in 1980 was akin to the Tennessee game last year. That was that would have been fun to go back and kind of relive. I'd like to go back. I wonder if there's any news reports or anything like that online or anything. I wouldn't mind seeing some of that build up. That would have been very, very good to go back and check and see. Let's see what else. Frederick Meredith says Matt Cavanaugh was the quarterback in that Pitt team that beat us 27-3. Yeah, that's back when Johnny Majors was the Pitt coach. Is that right? Majors was the Pitt coach then. That's good teams. Let's see what else. Frank Patterson says, who had the more memorable run versus Tennessee? Walker versus Bill Bates, or the mailman, the call me move. Yeah, the Stetson Bennett, rushing touchdown against Tennessee is going to live on for a long time. One of the things I've always enjoyed about the Herschel Walker run over Bates is that when that gets shown as a part of the pregame video at Georgia, it still elicits a huge reaction even now. So, as one of our commenters mentioned, the natural passing of time kind of makes it a little bit harder to remember certain things. That may be true for Herschel Walker, but when they show that run over Bates in that 1980 Tennessee game, it still gets the whoom reaction from the crowd each and every time. As I was saying, it kind of caused me to think about something I've considered before. Do you know if you made Back to the Future today, the classic movie from the 1980s with Michael J. Fox, the DeLorean goes back in time, that if you made the movie today, the period of time that it would be referencing would be 1993 if you used the same distance of time. The movie in 1985 was referencing 1955. And if you made it today, 2023, you'd be looking back to 1993, which is a horrifying thing to consider, an absolutely horrifying thing to consider for those of us who remember the 90s, that our 90s is now someone else's 50s. Like, that's horrifying. But it does cause me to consider, as I think it was Enrique said earlier, is that some of the Herschel Walker stuff is people just don't remember the 80s anymore. I wonder if we're about due for the 80s to drop off as a pop cultural thing. Because, when I was a kid, the 50s were kind of a big deal. Like, Back to the Future referenced the 50s. There was a lot of 50s stuff. There's oldie stations, things like that. The 50s were still pretty big in the 80s. But nobody knew anything but the 40s. The 40s had just completely dropped off. Nobody knew the 40s, but people knew the 50s. Well, now, if you look around, the 90s are pretty popular right now. 90s country, 90s hip-hop, 90s rock, all of that stuff's still pretty popular. But now that's sort of the retro decade. I wonder if the 80s are about to drop off as a pop cultural thing, if we're about to lose the 80s. I hope not, but we could be. Frederick asks, who won the national title in 76? Who did win the national championship in 76? I don't think I know. It wasn't Pitt, I don't think. I don't know. That's a good question. Let us see. Let's see what else. Dave Snow reminding us of the 1950s, Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, American Graffiti. Yeah, that's the other thing, too. It's so all those shows in the 1980s, you know how, people today watch The Office and Friends on, Netflix or whatever they're on? Back then, all those shows came on at, 6 o'clock on your, sort of lesser TV stations. They were all running, Happy Days and stuff like that all the time. So I felt like as a kid in the 80s, I knew a lot about the 50s, just because the 50s were around a good bit. Baseball cards were popular, and back then, people were collecting all those 1950s cards. But nobody knew anything but the 40s. The 40s had, other than World War II, the 40s had no cultural relevance whatsoever. I'm fearful that the 80s may be erased here soon. Y'all keep your head on a swivel for that. Be careful about that. That may be on its way. Scott Gentry, and we'll make this our final comment because I've got to go. Actually, I want to read two comments. Eric DeVorncy said, I had a high schooler refer to the 1993 as the 1900s. It threw me for a loop. Yeah, that's not how you want the 1990s referred to, as the previous century. That's a little scary. Eric, that's pretty funny. Scott Gentry says, do you think our offense is going to be our strongest or the defense, or are they going to be pretty equal? I think the one thing that Georgia hopes to be is pretty equal here this year. I do. I mean, that's one of the things I think that has kind of set Georgia apart from previous versions of Georgia under Kirby Smart and other competition around college football. is they really did find that successful way to play complementary football. They definitely did that, and it worked out really well. All right, so this is about as long as a R.S. Andrews cool downs we've done, but I've been gone for a long time, so I wanted to do right by all you folks. So thanks for being here. Y'all check out R.S. Andrews online for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that, including, by the way, real summer is here now. For a long time, we had this sort of like mild pre-summer. Well, that ain't true anymore. It is hot. Big time hot. So time to get that air conditioning unit ready to go for the rest of the summer that's on its way. And R.S. Andrews got you covered on all of that. So make sure you check that out, including, as one of our commenters mentioned earlier, Braves keep playing well. Surging past the Twins here in a revenge game from the 1991 World Series. Don't forget about that, folks. Speaking of the 90s, I know y'all remember that. And by the way, Marcell Ozuna continues to, he said, quite the turnaround for his season. So you can check out more of that online at AJC.com. Also, some really cool resorts around the state of Georgia that you might not be aware of that have some really good kind of all-inclusive type offers. You can read about that online as well, AJC.com. So check them out today, and then we'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.